So what will the world be like, say, 10 years from now? Well, for sure it'll be a multipolar world. Will the trial of strength between the US and China end by then? I doubt it. Would there be a peace agreement on Ukraine where Europeans and Russians are happy with the outcome? I doubt it. Will there be an equilibrium in the Middle East where Israelis and Palestinians walk with linked arms to the rising sun? I doubt it. Will America continue to dominate the world the way it did in the past? I doubt it. It'll be a multipolar world. Of that, we can be sure. And perhaps nothing more symbolically important than the recent summits in China, where you had Xi Jinping, Putin, and Modi holding hands. And in Beijing, where Xi Jinping marched out with Putin on one side and Kim Jong-un on the other. And further on, Tokayev and Prabowo. Why Tokayev and Prabowo? Because in 2013, when Xi Jinping announced a Belt and Road Initiative, he did it first in Astana, end of August, and then more than a month later in Jakarta. China has an old statecraft, and for them, symbolisms are very important. The parade is to awe people, right? Because the marching was perfect. It was ridiculously perfect. I was a soldier before. I had to command parades. I thought, wow, how did they do that? You can practice every day and you may still not achieve that. But somehow they were able to do it. In the Pentagon, you might have read the report that the orders for pizza from Papa Joe and Dominic shot up 4 times because they're all watching carefully who were there and what were the new weapon systems being displayed. Why did China invest so much time and effort? Is it to intimidate the world? I think for sure Trump was an important audience for them. Because what they don't want is for the Americans to miscalculate and trigger off a war with China. They have to show some cards so that Americans would hold back. They were hoping that India would be on their side against China. But I remember meeting Jai Shankar, the foreign minister in Abu Dhabi. I asked him, will India buy the S-400? I said, the US will sanction you. He said, we'll buy the S-400. And if they want, let them sanction us. I had no doubts that India will calculate in its own self-interest. Perhaps there was a time when they thought, yeah, they could make use of the US against China. Then when the Ukraine war happened, the US expected India to repudiate Russia. India would never do that because Russia was a strategic partner for decades. And when after Pahalgam, they had this air war with Pakistan, where India was bloodied, and India wanted the US to support them against Pakistan. The US would not do it. Instead, Trump invited the armed forces chief to the White House for lunch, and he promised to nominate Trump for the Nobel Prize. India, it's an adult relationship between India and the US. And when Modi went to Tianjin for the SCO meeting, it was partly to signal to the Americans, we will calculate in our own self-interest. China has been very careful to keep its relationship with India as much on an even keel as possible, because it is not in China's interest to have the rest of the world gang up against it. In a sense, it's been fortunate because the Ukraine war, the Middle East, these are distant conflicts. So the Chinese approach is don't get too involved. Don't be a troublemaker, be a peacemaker. But it's not a bad thing for American and Western attention to be diverted away from China. I think Europe is in a very difficult situation because European leaders were charging ahead with the US up front. And suddenly the US turned around and said, I'll be mediator. And they were still charging. And they're still charging today. And Americans have decided that, hey, you should make peace with Russia. I think this leadership crisis in Europe will continue for a period of time. But at the end of it, Europe must find its own center of gravity and act in its own self-interest. It will always have a strong relationship with America for historical and civilizational reasons. But Europe has its own interests vis-a-vis Russia, in the Middle East, and in Africa. To me, what is most worrying for Europe is high energy prices. Because energy price, energy efficiency, and availability undergirds all economic activities. In fact, it undergirds all biological life and is a key driver of evolution. If you have excess energy, whether because you can eat more, you can eat somebody else to acquire energy from that person or animal, then you can reproduce and you can defend yourself. And once you move into AI, the limiting factor will be energy, because all coding requires energy to reverse entropy. And if you have high energy prices, you'll be in trouble sooner or later. I mean, Libya was going to be a major provider of energy to Europe. It's got enormous oil and gas resources. I always suspected that Americans did not want that. The Chinese were major investors in Libya. Today, Libya is a basket case. Russia supplied cheap energy to Europe. Well, today, that's past. America is now a supplier of energy to Europe, and Europe pays a premium for it. I don't believe this will continue for too long because European industry is being undermined. So if you look further ahead, Europe cannot depend upon Trump striking a deal with Putin. And even if Xi Jinping were cooperative, there will be no deal because in the end, the deal must be between Europe and Russia. And it has to be based upon a knowledge of history. Because Russia is not going to disappear, Poland is not going to disappear. The Baltic states, the Balkans, will always be uneasily at the junction of where major tectonic plates meet. So if we cast our minds ahead, the world will be multipolar. It will not be a stable equilibrium, it will be a dynamic equilibrium. Some of you might have read the famous Chinese science fiction, The Three-Body Problem. That if there are three suns circulating around each other, the mathematics is almost impossible to solve. And if you're a planet in that system, your days and nights are completely unpredictable. And this is at the heart of the science fiction. In a multipolar world, there will be many suns or big planets circulating one against the other. So the dynamics will be complicated. And I think that's the reason why the immigration officer in Amsterdam wanted to listen to a lecture on geopolitics, because instinctively people feel the world is out of joint. And they're not quite sure how to react. Where do I live? Where do I go to school? How do I diversify my assets? What languages do I want my children to study? In earlier periods of history, every time you had a kaleidoscopic change in global politics, the future is often to be found in the interstitial spaces. So during the medieval period, you had the free cities, like the cities at Hansa, which till today are still called the free and Hanseatic city of Bergen or Lübeck or Hamburg. Into those cities flowed money and talent wanting freedom. So in some ways, what we achieved in Singapore foreshadowed the Asia that we see today. The cities of China, Southeast Asia, and India, they've all studied Singapore for our successes and mistakes, more than we ourselves realize. In Europe, after the war, the Benelux countries played a major role. If we look into the future, maybe the smaller countries, in their discomfort with the current equilibrium and wanting to find pathways for themselves, in them we may find ideas for the future. You know, Orban is kind of cancelled in Europe, but I like him, and I'm going to Hungary. And I just read the speech he gave recently where he said, Western Europe will be in trouble. The future of Europe will be in Central Europe. Now, after Luxembourg, I'm going to Prague, I'm going to Budapest, I'm going to Croatia. And I find these very interesting countries because they're not big enough. They are not former imperial powers who still, when they go to Asia, the instinct is to observe, judge, and lecture. You have all these very bright economists, journalists, especially from British and American newspapers. They will go to Asia, they will spend a month, interview people, and then they'll write a long piece with a prescription to each and every one of us as to how we should govern our country, and then we'll be more prosperous, we'll be happier. They will interview me, and I ask myself, if it was so simple, how is it in your own countries the problems remain? Because politics is a complicated matter. Their instinct is to immediately see us through a Western template, whether it's through a template of democracy versus autarky or the Thucydidean trap, and say, this is what's going to happen to you. This is your future. They will be wrong. Because to understand, you must first understand history and culture. No society can change its nature overnight. Because every day, how we treat one another, our presumptions, they have to be replicated every day, because otherwise life is not possible. When the Europeans went to Australia, and they saw how primitive the Aborigines were, they thought the best way is to take the children from their parents, educate them in modern schools, and pivot them into the modern world. The outcome was completely different from what they anticipated. I still can't forget what I saw in Western Australia, in Pilbara, where you have the largest iron deposit in the world. The sun was setting, and I saw all these Aboriginal people gathering in the open field. So I asked my host, what are they doing? He said, they're gathering now, they will drink alcohol into the night till they're piss drunk. They do that every day? He said, yes. You cannot take a people, cut them off at the knees, and transplant them as you would mark out a plant. It's not possible. The same thing with the Aboriginal people in North America, where the incidence of drug addiction and alcoholism remains very high. Begin with where people are, and from within themselves, help them. And to me, the best example is what the Jesuits did when they went to China. And many of you will be familiar with Matthew Ricci. I mean, Ignatius Loyola, he was a cripple because of war, but he wanted to convert China. So he said, who would do so? And Francis Xavier put up his hand. I mean, the audacity, you know. So he went to Japan. In the end, he died in the Pearl River Delta and never really set foot on mainland China. But when the Italian Matteo Ricci went to China, he thought, well, the Chinese would respect monks the way Europeans did. So he dressed as a Buddhist monk. And they scorned him because the Chinese look down on monks. You know. He said, but they look up to scholarship. And Matteo Ricci had an encyclopedic mind and a photographic memory. So he learned the Chinese language. Recently, I attended a lecture from a priest and a professor from Boston College, a Jesuit institution, where they have archives of Matteo Ricci's handwriting. He learned calligraphy. He developed his own phonetics to study Chinese. And he impressed the Chinese by scholarship. And one of the most difficult things to do was to translate Deus into Chinese. Because the Chinese did not have a European conception of God. They have a conception of heaven. The emperor was the son of heaven, Tianzi. The world was below heaven, Tianxia. And the legitimacy to rule is Tianming, the mandate of heaven. So he translated Deus into Tianzu, the Lord of heaven. In other words, not to interfere with secular political matters, that's for the emperor. But what is above the emperor? Until today, the translation of the Catholic religion in Chinese is Tianzu Jiao, the religion of the Lord of heaven. The catechism books of that period, they all had Jesus, Mary, Joseph, the apostles, Moses, Abraham as Chinese people. Because you cannot persuade highly intelligent people that their gods are foreign. They have to be of themselves. And little by little, they indigenized the Catholic religion in China. But of course, they failed. The Vatican is still trying. It's an old civilization. It's like millions of lines in the operating system. You can't just alter one part and expect it to function. You can't do to the Chinese what the British did to the Aborigines or the Americans did to the American Indians. You can't do that. So when Xi Jinping said, Christianity must be cynicized, the Western view is cynical. It's trying to corrupt the Catholic religion. No. What he's saying is, for it to take root, it must emerge from their very being. So when we talk about a multipolar world, whether we're talking about India or Brazil or Africa or China or Russia, first understand their history, their intellectual and philosophical underpinnings. And if you seek to change them, assuming you have right on your side, work from within themselves. And first be prepared to also learn from them. Because if you don't learn from them, you can't teach them. I mean, as teachers, we know, if we arrogate to ourselves a monopoly of knowledge, our students will lose their respect for us immediately. They've already Googled, they've already somehow have a sense of the subject. If you see a doctor and he dismisses what you say, which you've found out from ChatGPT, you lose respect for the doctor. He must say, oh, yes, ChatGPT says this, the book says that, but there are these considerations. Then you'll be persuaded. But if you are not prepared to learn, you cannot teach. But it takes time. It takes effort. China is a big subject. Russia is a big subject. India is a big subject. Africa is a big subject. Of course, we can master everything. But the key is attitude. There must be a humility that what I know and my perspective is limited by my own past. And someone else observing the same phenomenon might have a very different view. And once the attitude is centered in this way, communication flows and the world becomes more comprehensible and the possibilities for win-win outcomes much improved. What is worrying today is almost a refusal to understand each other. I'm very sensitive now when I'm in Europe. I mean, in East Asian circles, Singapore is S, Russia is R. So we're permanent neighbors. So I've seen Putin many times. I've seen Lavrov many times. I count Lavrov as a friend. But when I come to Europe, I'm very careful not to say that because my European friends may get angry with me. But why should they be angry with me? If you want a solution, your approach should be, you know Lavrov? Tell me about him. What animates him? What are his fears and concerns? Knowledge. I attended a peace forum in Tsinghua University. I did not see a single senior American. I asked my Chinese host. I said, did you not invite them? He said, we did, but they won't come because they were afraid of being criticized at home. Can you imagine that? How can you seek a solution if your starting point is, I do not want to talk to the other side? And if you will not talk to the other side, you will begin to demonize the other side. And then you will think of harming that other side. You demonize, you dehumanize, you work yourself into a lose-lose outcome. Whereas if we understand one another and almost be curious about the differences that separate us, that make each of us unique, then the possibilities for collaboration, for win-win outcomes becomes much greater. Kissinger has often said that in his negotiations with Zhou Enlai and with Mao Zedong, they always come back to Taiwan. So in the end, the breakthrough in relations was when the US recognized one China. It was fudged initially when Kissinger very cleverly came up with this phrase that Chinese on both sides of the straits recognize only one China. In 1979, when Carter established diplomatic relations with China, that one China is represented by Beijing. In fact, the idea of one China was first proclaimed in Cairo during the war, when Chiang Kai-shek attended together with Roosevelt and Churchill. And this was confirmed in Potsdam. So the legality of China's claim over Taiwan is internationally recognized. It's not in doubt. No one questions it. But America would, of course, want China to be divided forever if possible. But that's not going to happen because the correlation of forces is shifting. The Indo-Pacific Command, headquartered in Honolulu, they've done many exercises. In the Western Pacific, the US depends on the aircraft carriers for the projection of power. Today, Chinese hypersonic missiles, every one of those aircraft carriers are at risk. And Peter Hegseth, the defense secretary, before he became defense secretary, talked about it. So they had to be far away. But even Guam is within striking range. So the Americans will have to use cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. But China has many more of those missiles, or potentially can produce many more of those missiles. A nuclear exchange is too dangerous because China has enough warheads to effectively destroy American cities. Furthermore, if there's war over Taiwan, TSMC will be destroyed. If TSMC is destroyed, America will be deprived of its chips, Europe will be deprived of its chips. But China can carry on, maybe 70-80%. But China has quite a formidable chip-making capability, which is improving by the month. And China now has played its most important trump card, which is rare earths, to which the US has no response. Because without the magnets, you can't build F-35s, you can't have your bunker buster bombs. You have no defense industry. And the Chinese do not want to overplay that card, so they keep the US on the short leash, where they supply every 6 months with end-user certificates. The US keeps China on the short leash on chip technology. So each has leashed the other. So I don't think there'll be war over Taiwan.